Hey, brothers and sisters. In case you missed it, Andy Woods was a guest on Tom Hughes' show today, and I wanted to play this clip because I thought it was interesting his take on the fig tree prophecy. So here it is.
All right.
Okay. What is Dr. Wood's theory on the fig tree generation?
Well, here again, Tom, it's going to be disappointing to people because, ever since the Hal Lindsey days, and I will say I probably learned more about prophecy from Hal Lindsey than anybody else, but he kind of had this view that, you have to go a generation from 1948, whether it's 40 years and then that date came and went, or 80 years. Then they switched the date to 1967. We've got to go 40 to 80 years, and then the rapture will happen. And then I noticed a lot of guys are going to Psalm 90, where it says a generation is 70 to 80 years. And so they start with 1948 or the Six-Day War, 1967, and they try to run a calculation, what a generation is from that point. And they try to come up with a date for something in eschatology, either the rapture or something. And I think all of that is bankrupt because the terminus a quo is wrong. Terminus a quo is the starting point. They're all looking at 1948 or 1967 as the starting point. But when you look at this generation in context, who is Jesus talking to? He's talking to the generation of Jews that are living in the second half of the tribulation period that just saw their temple desecrated. That's the definitive sign there in verse 15. And the only thing Jesus is saying is that generation of Jews will not pass away until Jesus comes back and rescues them 42 months later. And boy, if there's ever a group of people that will need that promise, it's going to be that crowd. Because remember, Tom, Revelation 12, it's at that point that Satan loses permanent access to heaven. And he comes down and pursues the woman, or Israel, clothed with the sun and the moon and the 12 stars. And he actually is successful in eradicating 2/3 of the Jewish people during that time period. Zechariah 13, verses 8 and 9. And so they're going to need a word from the Lord, or a promise that in spite of this intense warfare, that generation will not pass away until Jesus comes back and rescues them. And it's basically a statement that the Jewish nation is not going to pass away in the second half of the tribulation period. And God can't allow them to pass away because he's got to fulfill his covenants through them, in the millennial kingdom. And I think that understanding of this generation fits well with what Jesus said about his generation. Remember at the end of Matthew 23, he said, all this, AD 70, will come upon this generation. He was talking about a specific generation of Jews in time. And when the identical expression is used in Matthew 24, he's talking about a specific identifiable Jews living at a point in time who are going to need a promise from God in spite of intense warfare. So linking this to 1948 and running a calculation is bankrupt. The terminus a quo, meaning beginning point, is off. And it was sort of the Hal Lindsey approach that got us all thinking this way. And as much as I love Hal Lindsey, I think what he introduced there was an error.
Yeah. That's an outstanding explanation. I think it's the best explanation I've ever heard on it. So when you look at the fig tree, because Jesus uses that illustration, he uses the fig tree. When you see the fig tree blossom, then you know that the summer is near. Hence, this generation will not pass away. Do you see... There's two schools of thought on this. One is the fig tree is specific to the nation of Israel, which takes people, I think, back to 1948. The other school of thought is, look, where Jesus is talking about the fig tree, he's talking about all the different signs, because he gave many different signs up to that point when he brings up the fig tree blossoming which category do you put the fig tree in? Do you say that fig tree is a reference to the nation of Israel? Or I totally get what you're saying about the second coming of Christ in relation to the destruction of the temple, the generation that sees that. In fact, again, I think that's outstanding explanation.
Yeah. Go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I do see the fig tree as the blossoming of Israel, but there's more to it than that. With the blossoming of Israel in 1948 is going to come a particular generation of Jews that are going to see their temple desecrated. And I'm just getting this from the context because the definitive sign in Matthew 24 is the desecration of the temple. And he tells them, when this happens, you need to, flee, into the mountains. Let those living in Judea, flee to the mountains. And that's the folks that he says, you're not going to pass away, that generation, until all of these things are fulfilled. So when he's talking about the fig tree, he's dealing with that particular generation. And it's the generation which sees all these things, which includes the rebirth of Israel, but it also includes a bunch of other things, such as the famines, the rumors of war, all of the things spoken of early in Matthew 24. It includes the desecration of the temple. And so that's the generation that, in other words, in my opinion, that's the fig tree generation. They're Jews living on the earth that have just seen their temple desecrated. That's the generation that sees all these things. And so the fig tree and the promise that they won't pass away, despite Satan's wrath in the second 42 months, is all for them. So, again, I know that's a boring interpretation because everybody wants to run a calculation from 1948, and that's why I keep saying, and this is a Latin expression, the terminus a quo is wrong. Terminus a quo is beginning point. The beginning point is not 1948. The beginning point is not 1967. The beginning point is the middle point of the tribulation when the temple is desecrated. That's when you start running your calculation.
Yeah, very good. That's fantastic